My name is Joan Ellis, and I am 63 years old. I am a retired counselor, a mother of 2 daughters, and a woman who spent her entire life believing that unconditional love could keep any family whole, no matter what storms life might bring. For decades, I poured my heart and soul into being the mother I thought my girls needed, the steady anchor in their lives who would always be there to catch them when they fell. I sacrificed everything for my daughters, Rachel and Sarah. When they were growing up, I put my promising career as a family counselor on hold, to be home every day after school, to help with homework, to drive them to every activity and appointment. I funded Rachel's dream wedding when she married Greg, emptying my retirement savings to give her the fairy tale celebration she had always envisioned. I paid for Sarah's art school tuition when she discovered her passion for painting, even though it meant taking out a second mortgage on our home. When my husband Robert fell gravely ill with cancer, I shielded both girls from the worst of his suffering, shouldering the burden of his care alone so they could focus on building their own lives. I gave my savings, my health, and my very soul for my girls, believing that a mother's love was the most precious gift I could ever offer them. But 3 months after Robert's funeral, when my grief was still raw and overwhelming, my world collapsed in the most devastating way imaginable. Sarah posted a lengthy, heart-wrenching message on social media that went viral within hours, accusing me of a lifetime of favoritism toward her sister Rachel. Her words cut through me like shards of glass. My mother never loved me the way she loved Rachel. I was always the afterthought, the second choice, the daughter who had to fight for scraps of attention. The post was orchestrated by Rachel herself, who had spent weeks convincing Sarah that I had never truly loved her equally. When I confronted Rachel about the cruel public humiliation, she looked me in the eye with shocking coldness and said, "Face it, Mom, you're a failure as a mother. You always have been." In that moment, standing in my empty house where Robert's presence still lingered in every corner, I felt my heart shatter into pieces I thought could never be mended. But as I sat there, drowning in despair and public shame, something deep within me began to stir. Rachel didn't know about the letters hidden in my desk drawer, the ones Robert had written during his final weeks. Letters that detailed Rachel's secret attempts to borrow money from him for Greg's failing business ventures, kept hidden from me to protect our family harmony. Those letters would reveal the truth about Rachel's true character and perhaps heal the wounds that were tearing our family apart. The morning after Sarah's devastating social media post had been shared thousands of times, I knew I couldn't let this destruction of our family continue without fighting for the truth. My hands trembled as I drove to Rachel's beautiful suburban home, the one I had helped finance with my retirement savings when she and Greg were first starting out. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to confront my daughter in a house that my own sacrifice had made possible. Rachel opened the door with an expression that was neither surprised nor apologetic. She had been expecting this confrontation, and her face showed nothing but cold determination mixed with something that looked almost like satisfaction. Within moments, Greg appeared behind her, his arms crossed, and his expression hostile, clearly ready to support his wife in whatever battleground she had chosen to create. "We need to talk about Sarah's post," I said, my voice barely steady as I tried to maintain some semblance of maternal authority. "Rachel, how could you encourage her to write those things? How could you help her humiliate me publicly when I'm still grieving your father?" Sarah materialized from the kitchen, her presence completing the united front they had obviously planned. The sight of both my daughters standing together against me, their faces hard with shared resentment, was more devastating than any physical blow could have been. "Mom," Rachel said with theatrical weariness, "we need to stop pretending everything is fine. Sarah finally had the courage to tell the truth about how you treated us, and frankly, it's about time someone called you out on your obvious favoritism." Greg produced his phone and began scrolling through what I would later realize were carefully edited text message screenshots. "Look at this," he said, showing me images that had been doctored to make it appear as though I had written cruel, dismissive messages to Sarah. "These are the real texts you sent to Sarah over the years. No wonder she felt unloved and unwanted." The screenshots were convincing forgeries, taking innocent messages and adding context that made them sound harsh and rejecting. My stomach turned as I realized the extent of their planning and manipulation. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst of hurt feelings. This was a coordinated attack designed to rewrite the history of our family relationships. But the manipulation was just the beginning. Rachel's true agenda began to emerge as she shifted the conversation toward finances with the cold calculation of someone who had been planning this moment for months. "Mom, you need to face some hard truths," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum. "Dad's death has changed everything, and we can't afford to let you make poor decisions with family money. Those savings you've been hoarding need to be distributed to the people who actually deserve them." Greg nodded enthusiastically, his eyes lighting up with greed. "Rachel and I have been discussing this extensively. We need those funds for legitimate family investments. My business is expanding, and we could triple that money within a year if you'd stop being so selfish about it." Sarah joined in with her own demands, her voice filled with the self-righteous anger of someone who truly believed she had been wronged. "You owe me, Mom. Years of emotional neglect don't just disappear because Dad died. That money could fund my art career, help me finally get the recognition I deserve." Despite the cruelty of their attacks, I still harbored a desperate hope that this was all some terrible misunderstanding driven by grief and financial stress. "Rachel's sweetheart," I pleaded, my voice breaking with emotion. "I know you're both hurting from losing Dad. I know you might be worried about money in the future, but I loved you both equally always. Every decision I made was to try to give you both the best life possible." I reminded them of countless moments that proved my equal devotion, the nights I stayed up with Sarah when she had nightmares, the way I cheered just as loudly at Rachel's school, plays the birthday parties, where I made sure each girl felt equally special and celebrated. Please remember the mother who taught you to ride bikes, who helped you with broken hearts, who believed in your dreams when no one else did. That love hasn't changed just because Dad is gone. But my words fell on deaf ears. The humiliation that followed was systematic and merciless, designed to break down my resistance and force me into compliance with their demands. Sarah returned to social media with a vengeance, posting a follow-up message that painted me as not just neglectful, but actively cruel. "My heartless mother can't even acknowledge the pain she caused," she wrote. "She's more concerned about protecting her image than taking responsibility for the damage she's done to her own daughter." Greg took the campaign to our church community, where I had worshiped and served for over 20 years. He spread carefully crafted lies about my parenting, telling anyone who would listen that I had emotionally neglected Sarah while lavishing attention on Rachel. "Joan always had a favorite," he would say with false sympathy. Poor Sarah never stood a chance of getting equal love from her own mother. The damage to my reputation was swift and devastating. People who had known me for decades began to look at me with suspicion and disappointment. Women who had once asked for my advice about their own children now whispered behind my back about my failures as a mother. but the cruelest demands were yet to come. Rachel's voice grew commanding and authoritative as she laid out their expectations with the precision of someone delivering a business ultimatum. "You're going to sign over the house to us," she announced, her tone brooking no argument. "It's too big for you now anyway, and we need the equity for family stability. Sarah deserves her inheritance while she's young enough to use it properly." Greg's addition was even more outrageous. "You'll also need to cover our legal fees for handling Dad's estate properly. After all, your emotional neglect of Sarah has created this whole mess, so you should pay to fix it." Sarah's final demand was the cruelest cut of all. "I want Grandma's jewelry collection," she said, referring to the precious heirlooms that had been passed down through 3 generations. "You never deserved them anyway, and they should go to someone who actually appreciates family history." As I drove home that evening, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I felt like a stranger in my own life. The daughters I had raised, loved, and sacrificed for had revealed themselves to be calculating strangers who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their financial goals. But somewhere deep inside my shattered heart, a small flame of resistance was beginning to flicker. They had underestimated their mother, and that would prove to be their greatest mistake. The harassment didn't end with that first devastating confrontation. Like predators who had caught the scent of blood, Rachel and her allies became bolder and more vicious with each passing day. The systematic campaign they launched against me revealed depths of cruelty I never could have imagined from my own children. Greg's demands escalated beyond mere financial extortion to outright exploitation. He called me multiple times a day, his voice filled with false concern that barely masked his growing list of requirements. "Joan, you need to start contributing to this family instead of just taking from it," he would say during his increasingly aggressive phone calls. "You're still young enough to work part-time. You could be earning money to help support Sarah's art career instead of sitting around feeling sorry for yourself." The suggestion that I should return to work at 63, still deep in grief over my husband's death, was both heartless and absurd. But Greg's cruelty didn't stop there. He had somehow gained access to my bank accounts, and I began to notice unauthorized withdrawals and transfers that were draining my savings at an alarming rate. When I confronted Rachel about the financial theft, she showed me forged documents that appeared to give her power of attorney over my finances. "Dad signed these before he died." She lied smoothly, producing papers that looked official but felt wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. "He was worried about your mental state and wanted to make sure someone responsible was watching over your money." The forgeries were convincing enough to fool the bank initially, and I watched in horror as thousands of dollars disappeared from accounts I had spent decades building. My financial security, the safety net that was supposed to carry me through my golden years, was being systematically stolen by my own daughter. It was during this period of financial assault that the most painful realization began to dawn on me. As I sat in my empty house, surrounded by the silence that Robert's death had left behind, I finally understood the truth that had been staring me in the face for months. Rachel had never seen me as her mother, not really. I was nothing more than a convenient source of funding and labor, an ATM machine disguised as a parent. All those years of sacrifice, all those nights I had stayed up worrying about her future, all those times I had put her needs above my own, had meant nothing to her. I was just a resource to be exploited until I was no longer useful. The weight of this understanding was crushing. Every memory I had treasured as evidence of our mother-daughter bond now felt tainted by the knowledge that she had been calculating the entire time. The hugs, the Mother's Day cards, the tearful phone calls when she needed advice or comfort. Had any of it been real, or was it all just part of a long-term strategy to keep me compliant and generous? But the deepest wound was yet to be revealed. As I sat there drowning in my despair, I remembered the sacrifice that had cost me the most, the one that had fundamentally changed who I was as a person and as a mother. When Robert was diagnosed with cancer, I made the conscious decision to shield both girls from the worst of his illness. Rachel was just starting her marriage, and Sarah was struggling to establish herself as an artist. I didn't want their futures to be derailed by the horror of watching their father slowly dying, so I carried that burden alone. I attended every doctor's appointment, managed every medication schedule, held Robert's hand through every treatment session. I slept in hospital chairs, learned to operate medical equipment, and became his full-time caregiver while trying to maintain the illusion for our daughters that everything was manageable. The stress of that period had triggered a deep depression that I had hidden from everyone, including Robert himself. I had neglected my own health, both physical and mental, because every ounce of energy I possessed was devoted to caring for him and protecting our children from the reality of his condition. My hands, once steady from years of counseling work, had developed a tremor from the constant stress. My sleep patterns were destroyed by months of interrupted nights in the hospital. My own immune system had weakened to the point where I caught every illness that came through the hospital, but I had hidden all of this from my family because I thought that was what a good mother and wife was supposed to do. But when I tried to explain this sacrifice to Rachel, hoping she might understand the depth of my love and the price I had paid to protect her, her response was pure poison. "That's exactly the problem, Mom," she said, her voice dripping with false psychology and real cruelty. "You created an unhealthy dynamic by hiding Dad's condition from us. Sarah feels guilty now because she wasn't there for him, and that guilt is part of why she resents you so much. You caused her emotional damage by trying to protect her." Greg joined the attack with his own twisted interpretation of my sacrifices. "You probably made Dad's illness worse by being so controlling about his care. If you had let the family be involved, if you hadn't acted like you were the only one who could handle it, maybe he would have had a better quality of life in his final months." The suggestion that my devoted caregiving had somehow harmed Robert was so cruel, so fundamentally wrong, that it took my breath away. I had given everything to make his final months as comfortable and dignified as possible, and they were twisting that sacrifice into evidence of my selfishness and inadequacy. But Rachel and Greg weren't finished with their psychological warfare. They had developed what they clearly considered to be the perfect solution to my problem, a solution that would remove me from their lives while giving them access to everything I owned. "There's a nice assisted living facility about 40 minutes from here," Rachel said, her voice taking on the businesslike tone of someone disposing of an inconvenient burden. "Very affordable, very appropriate for someone in your situation. You can sell the house, use that money to pay for a few years of care, and we'll handle settling Dad's estate properly." Greg nodded approvingly, clearly having researched this option extensively. "It's perfect for someone with your health issues and financial limitations. They have activities, meals provided, and you won't have to worry about maintaining that big house anymore or being a burden on your children." Sarah's contribution was the cruelest touch of all. "You could sign over your pension to help establish a trust fund for my art career. After all the emotional damage you've caused me, it's the least you can do to help me rebuild my life." As I listened to them calmly planning my exile and the theft of everything I had worked for. Something fundamental inside me finally snapped. The last vestiges of maternal hope, the final threads of unconditional love were severed completely. I was no longer their victim or their resource. I was their enemy, and they had just declared war on a woman who had far more strength and knowledge than they could possibly imagine. The final assault on my dignity and my life came exactly 2 weeks later, on a day that should have been peaceful and healing. I was in my garden, tending to the roses that Robert and I had planted together during our early years of marriage, when Rachel and Greg arrived at my home with the cold efficiency of professional eviction agents. There was no pretense of family warmth this time, no false concern or hollow greetings. They had come to execute the final phase of their plan, and their faces showed nothing but grim determination to finish what they had started. "Pack your things, Mom," Rachel announced without any preamble, her voice as cold and final as a death sentence. "You have 3 days to clear out completely. The realtor is coming on Friday to assess the property value, and we need it empty and ready for sale." Greg stood behind her like a bodyguard holding a manila folder that I assumed contained more forged legal documents designed to steal my home through fraudulent means. "The assisted living facility has an opening," he added with false helpfulness. "We've already put down a deposit to hold the space for you. 3 days. I whispered, my hands still dirty from the garden soil, still holding the small pruning shears I had been using to care for flowers that held decades of precious memories. "Rachel, this is my home. This is where you and Sarah grew up. This is where your father and I built our life together. It's too big for you now," she replied with the casual dismissal of someone throwing away an old piece of furniture. "You can't maintain it properly, and the equity needs to be used for more important family purposes. Sarah's art career isn't going to fund itself." The legal documents Greg handed me were masterpieces of deception. They claimed I had agreed to transfer ownership of the house to Rachel in exchange for her promise to care for me in my old age. The signatures looked authentic, but I knew I had never signed anything of the kind. But even faced with this ultimate betrayal, every instinct I had developed over 30 years as a family counselor compelled me to make one final desperate attempt to reach the daughters I had raised with such love and hope. I fell to my knees right there in the garden, my hands clasped together in supplication, garden dirt still under my fingernails, and poured out my heart to the two people I had loved more than my own life. "Rachel, Sarah, please," I begged, tears streaming down my face as I looked up at their cold, impassive expressions. "Remember who we used to be to each other. Remember Christmas mornings when you would run to wake me and Dad so we could open presents together. Remember the bedtime stories I read to you every night, the way I would sing you to sleep when you had nightmares." My voice broke with the weight of accumulated memories and desperate love. "Remember how I held you when your hearts were broken, how I cheered at every school play and graduation, how I taught you to drive and helped you pick out prom dresses. Remember the mother who believed in your dreams when no one else did, who sacrificed her own ambitions so you could have everything you wanted." I reached out toward them with trembling hands, begging for some recognition of the bond we had once shared. "I held you in my arms when you were babies. I was there for your first steps, your first words, your first days of school. How can you throw away a lifetime of love? How can you forget that everything I did, every sacrifice I made, was because I loved you more than life itself?" But my words might as well have been spoken in a foreign language. Sarah's response came not through words, but through a text message she sent while standing right in front of me. She typed on her phone and then held the screen up for me to read, "You're dead to me." 4 words that destroyed every hope I had harbored for reconciliation or understanding. My own daughter standing in the garden where I had pushed her on a swing set as a child had just declared me dead to her. But the cruelty wasn't finished. The next morning, I discovered that Greg had vandalized my mailbox during the night, spray painting the words "Bad Mom" across it in red letters. The message was visible to every neighbor, every passerby, a public declaration of shame designed to humiliate me in my own community. Rachel's final cruelty was perhaps the most devastating of all. She called me that afternoon to deliver what she clearly intended as the killing blow to any remaining hope I might have for family reconciliation. "I want you to know," she said, her voice filled with cold satisfaction, "that you will never see your grandchildren again. I've already explained to them that Grandma Joan never really loved them, that she was always too busy playing favorites to care about anyone else's children. They understand now why we have to cut you out of our lives." The thought of my precious grandchildren being poisoned against me being told lies about my love for them was almost more than I could bear. I had dreamed of being the kind of grandmother who would spoil them with cookies and stories, who would be their safe harbor when the world became too complicated or scary. But in that moment of absolute darkness, when I felt like they had successfully stripped away everything that had ever mattered to me, the words came pouring out of me like water from a burst dam. All the pain, all the secret knowledge I had carried, all the truth I had hidden to protect them, exploded in a torrent that would change everything. "You want to know the truth about your father's final months." I screamed into the phone, my voice carrying decades of suppressed hurt and carefully guarded secrets. "Go to my desk drawer, the bottom one on the right. Look behind the photo of your wedding day. You'll find the letters your father wrote during his last weeks in the hospital, letters he never intended for me to see." My voice grew stronger as I continued, fueled by the righteous anger of someone who had finally reached their breaking point. "He wrote about you, Rachel, about how you kept asking him for money for Greg's failing business ventures, about how you tried to get him to change his will behind my back, about how worried he was that you saw him as nothing more than a bank account." I could hear her sharp intake of breath, could imagine the color draining from her face as she realized the implications of what I was revealing. He wrote about how disappointed he was that his daughter had become someone he barely recognized, someone who measured love in dollar amounts and saw family relationships as business transactions. He wrote about how grateful he was that I had shielded him from having to confront you about your greed because he was too sick to handle that kind of heartbreak. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening, but I wasn't finished. 3 months of accumulated pain and betrayal poured out of me in a flood of truth that would shatter their carefully constructed narrative. "Your father loved you, Rachel, but he also saw exactly who you had become. He saw the way you manipulated Sarah against me, the way you calculated every interaction in terms of what you could gain from it. He was ashamed of what you had turned into, and he spent his final days writing about how much he regretted not teaching you better values." The line went dead, but I knew the damage was done. Rachel would find those letters, would read her father's own words describing her greed and manipulation, and would know that her carefully constructed victim narrative was built on lies. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair flowing through my veins. I felt the fierce satisfaction of truth finally being spoken of, secrets finally being revealed. They had pushed me beyond my breaking point, and now they would face the consequences of their cruelty. The war was far from over, but I had just fired the shot that would change everything. In the hours that followed my explosive revelation about Robert's letters, I experienced something I hadn't felt since before my husband's death, absolute clarity. The fog of grief, confusion, and self-doubt that had clouded my judgment for months lifted, completely replaced by a steel-hard determination that surprised even me. I was no longer the broken, pleading mother who had begged for scraps of affection from daughters who saw me as nothing more than a convenient target for their greed and manipulation. I picked up my phone and called Rachel one final time. When she answered, her voice was shaky and uncertain in a way I had never heard before. She had found Robert's letters. She had read his words. She knew that her carefully constructed narrative of victimhood was built on lies, and that knowledge had shaken her to her very core. "Mom," she began, her voice carrying a tremor of fear that gave me deep satisfaction. "We need to talk about those letters. Maybe there's been some misunderstanding, some way we can work this out without anyone else getting hurt." "No, Rachel," I said, my voice steady and calm as mountain stone. "We're done talking. We're done negotiating. We're done pretending to be a family. You made your choice when you decided to destroy my reputation, steal my money, and turn my own grandchildren against me. You chose greed over love, manipulation over honesty, cruelty over compassion." I could hear her sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone who had finally realized the magnitude of their mistake. "Mom, you can't be serious. You don't have the resources to fight us. You don't have lawyers or connections or support. You're just a retired counselor with no real power." "You're right about one thing, Rachel. I was just a retired counselor. But I was also your father's beloved wife, the woman he trusted with his deepest concerns about your character. And you have no idea what other evidence I have, what other people know the truth, or how far I'm willing to go to protect myself from your continued abuse." My voice carried a strength that surprised even me. "You're not my daughter anymore. You're not my family. You're just another person who tried to steal from me and destroy me, and I don't let criminals win." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel had expected tears, pleading, perhaps even a pathetic attempt at reconciliation. She had not expected this transformed version of me, this woman who had finally found her backbone and her voice after decades of putting everyone else's needs first. My transformation had only begun, but Rachel and Greg, still clinging to their arrogant assumptions about my powerlessness, made the fatal error of dismissing my newfound resolve as nothing more than the desperate posturing of a defeated old woman. "She's having some kind of breakdown," Greg told his business associates, not knowing that one of them would later share his words with me. "Grief has made her delusional. She's making up stories about secret letters and imaginary evidence. We just need to wait for her to calm down and accept reality." Sarah joined in their mockery with the cruel enthusiasm of someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions. "What's she going to do? Fight us with her pension money? Take us to court with her Social Security checks? She's pathetic and powerless. She'll be back begging for our forgiveness within a week, just like she always does." They could not have been more wrong. Instead of collapsing under the weight of their continued cruelty, I found strength in my anger and purpose in my pain. I stopped trying to contact Rachel. I stopped pleading for recognition or reconciliation. I stopped being the victim they expected me to remain. Instead, I reached out to Ellen Morrison, my oldest friend and former colleague from my counseling days. Ellen had watched from a distance as my family situation deteriorated, and she had been waiting for me to ask for help. When I finally called her, she didn't hesitate to offer both emotional support and practical assistance. "Joan," she said when I told her the truth about what Rachel and Greg had been doing, "what you're describing isn't just family dysfunction. It's elder abuse, financial fraud, and systematic emotional manipulation. You don't have to handle this alone anymore. Ellen became my anchor in the storm, helping me organize my thoughts, gather evidence, and plan my next moves. For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. I had an ally, someone who understood both my professional background and my personal strength. Before I completely cut contact with Rachel's family, I left one final message. I placed a simple white envelope on Rachel's front door, just as I had done months earlier when this war began. Inside was a note written in my careful handwriting. Your father's letters were just the beginning. Your deceit will unravel thread by thread until everyone sees you for who you truly are. You chose this path when you decided to destroy your mother. Now walk it alone. But Rachel and Greg were not finished with their campaign of intimidation and threats. Greg, his business training finally kicking in, began making ominous statements about having me declared mentally incompetent. She's clearly suffering from some kind of psychotic break, he told anyone who would listen, making up elaborate stories about secret letters claiming we're stealing from her when we're just trying to help. We might need to have her committed for her own safety. The threats escalated when Rachel realized that her attempts at reconciliation had failed completely. She began posting on social media about my deteriorating mental state, claiming that grief had made me paranoid and delusional. She even suggested that I was a danger to myself and others, laying the groundwork for what I realized was a plan to have me institutionalized so they could gain complete control over my finances. But their campaign of character assassination backfired in ways they never anticipated. Instead of making me look crazy, their increasingly desperate attempts to discredit me began to make them look vindictive and cruel. People who had known me for decades recognized the inconsistency between their claims and the woman they had worked with and respected for years. Sarah's final attempt to break my resolve came in the form of a public Facebook post that she clearly thought would deliver the killing blow to my resistance. My mother has chosen her pride over her family, she wrote. Even faced with the truth about her favoritism and neglect, she refuses to take responsibility for the pain she's caused. Instead, she's making up stories and threatening the people who love her most. I don't know if I can forgive her for abandoning me when I need her most. But her words, which once would have shattered my resolve, now only strengthened it. I had finally learned to recognize manipulation, even when it came wrapped in the voice of my own child. Sarah was no longer the hurt daughter I had tried so desperately to comfort and reassure. She was another weapon in Rachel's arsenal, another tool being used to break me down and force my surrender. For the first time in months, I felt the sweet sensation of liberation flowing through my veins. I was no longer bound by their expectations, no longer held hostage by their approval or disapproval. I had found my strength, my voice, my purpose. Justice was beginning to unfold slowly but surely, and I was no longer its victim, but its agent. Ellen's support proved to be more valuable than I could have imagined. As a fellow retired counselor, she understood both the psychological dynamics of family abuse and the practical steps needed to fight back against systematic manipulation. But more than that, she had connections throughout our professional community, people who could provide the kind of help I desperately needed. Joan, she said during one of our coffee meetings, I want you to meet someone who specializes in exactly the kind of situation you're facing. Laura Chen is a community mediator who works with families torn apart by financial abuse and elder exploitation. She's helped dozens of people in situations similar to yours. Laura turned out to be a sharp, compassionate woman in her 40s who had built her career helping seniors fight back against family members who tried to exploit their vulnerability. When Ellen explained my situation, Laura's expression grew serious and focused. "What you're describing is a textbook case of coordinated elder abuse," she told me during our first meeting. "The social media attacks the forged documents, the attempts to isolate you from support systems. These are all classic tactics used by family members who see elderly relatives as sources of money rather than people deserving of respect." But Laura offered more than just validation of my experience. She provided practical help, legal resources, and most importantly, a framework for fighting back that would restore not just my financial security, but my standing in the community. The opportunity to reclaim my purpose came sooner than I expected. Our local community center was launching a new youth mentoring program designed to connect experienced adults with teenagers who were struggling with family issues, academic challenges, or life transitions. When Laura mentioned the program, I immediately saw it as a chance to use my counseling background in a meaningful way while rebuilding my reputation. Joan, the program coordinator, said when I applied to be a mentor, "Your background in family counseling makes you exactly the kind of volunteer we're looking for. These kids need someone who understands complex family dynamics and can offer genuine guidance based on real experience." The work was challenging, but deeply fulfilling. I found myself counseling teenagers whose families were torn apart by divorce addiction and financial stress. My own recent experiences with family betrayal, while painful, gave me a unique ability to connect with young people who felt abandoned or manipulated by the adults in their lives. Within months, I had become one of the program's most respected volunteers. Parents specifically requested me as a mentor for their children, and my colleagues began asking me to lead training sessions for new volunteers. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I was making a real difference in the world. The program's success led to an opportunity that would prove crucial in my ongoing battle with Rachel's family. The community center was hosting a major fundraising event to expand the mentoring program, and they asked me to be one of the featured speakers, someone who could share the impact the program was having on both the young people we served and the volunteers who participated. I should have known that Greg wouldn't be able to resist the opportunity to interfere with my newfound success. As I was preparing for my presentation greeting donors and community leaders who had come to support our work, I spotted a familiar figure near the registration table. Greg was there in his most expensive suit, working the crowd with the practiced charm of someone trying to drum up business connections. He had positioned himself as a potential major donor, clearly hoping to use the event as an opportunity to pitch his struggling business ventures to wealthy community members. The confrontation was inevitable. When Greg spotted me across the room, his expression shifted from false charm to something that looked like predatory satisfaction. He made his way through the crowd with deliberate purpose, clearly intending to create a scene that would undermine my credibility and authority. "Well, well," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear his voice dripping with false sympathy and real malice. "If it isn't Joan, the woman who's been telling everyone she's some kind of victim, how interesting to see you here, playing the role of community leader." Several donors and board members turned to watch our interaction, sensing the tension, but not understanding its source. Greg clearly intended to use their attention to maximum advantage, just as he had used social media to spread lies about my character. "I hope everyone here knows the real story about Joan." He continued, his voice carrying across the room with practiced projection. "She's not actually the devoted mother and selfless volunteer she pretends to be. She's a woman who played favorites with her own children, caused irreparable psychological damage to her youngest daughter, and is now using her fake victim story to gain sympathy and donations. The crowd was listening now, murmurs of confusion and concern rippling through the gathered donors. Greg was clearly enjoying his moment of power, his chance to destroy my reputation in front of the entire community that had welcomed me back. She's mentally unstable, vindictive, and completely unqualified to be counseling young people or handling other people's money. Ask her about the forged documents she's been waving around, claiming they prove her family is stealing from her. She's not a victim. She's a manipulative woman who can't accept responsibility for her own failures as a mother. For a moment, I felt the old familiar fear rising in my throat, the urge to flee, to hide, to accept the shame and humiliation he was trying to heap on me. But then I looked around at the faces of the people who had worked with me for months, who had seen my dedication and integrity firsthand, who had trusted me with their most vulnerable children. Laura was standing near the microphone, ready to introduce me for my presentation. The program coordinator was at the back of the room, his eyes filled with concern, but also with confidence in my character. The teenagers I had mentored were scattered throughout the crowd, all of them looking at me with expressions of support and encouragement. I realized that Greg had made the same crucial tactical error that had destroyed his allies before him. He had chosen to attack me not in isolation, where his lies might have gone unchallenged, but in front of people who actually knew me, who had worked with me, who had seen the evidence of my character through my actions rather than through someone else's accusations. I walked to the microphone with steady steps, my heart pounding, but my purpose clear. When I began to speak, my voice was calm, confident, and filled with the quiet authority that comes from knowing you're standing on solid ground. Thank you all for coming tonight to support our youth mentoring program. I began looking directly at Greg as I spoke. This program represents something very important to all of us, the belief that healing is possible, that young people can overcome family trauma and betrayal, and that community support can help anyone rebuild their life after experiencing abuse. I paused, letting my words sink in before continuing. Some of you may not know that this program literally saved my life at a time when my own family was trying to destroy it. When people I trusted tried to steal my finances, forge legal documents, and have me declared mentally incompetent, this community gave me a chance to prove my worth through my actions rather than through my family relationships. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Greg's confident expression began to falter as he realized that his attack had backfired spectacularly. Tonight, I'm proud to announce that our program has been awarded a $20,000 grant from the State Foundation for Family Services. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. This funding will allow us to expand our services and help even more young people who are struggling with family dysfunction and abuse. The applause was thunderous, drowning out whatever Greg might have tried to say in response. I had not only defended myself against his attack, but had delivered news that made his shallow business pitch look pathetic by comparison. As the crowd surged forward to congratulate me and learn more about our expansion plans, I caught a glimpse of Greg slipping out the back door, his face red with humiliation and rage. The success of the fundraising event and the community's overwhelming support for our mentoring program gave me something I hadn't possessed in months: real power and influence. Greg's clumsy attempt to sabotage my reputation had backfired so completely that he had actually strengthened my position within the community while exposing his own malicious character to dozens of potential business contacts. But I wasn't content to simply survive his attack. My experience with Rachel's family had taught me that defensive measures weren't enough when dealing with people who were determined to destroy you. If I wanted to protect myself and ensure they couldn't continue their campaign of harassment and fraud, I needed to go on the offensive. Laura, ever the strategic thinker, helped me understand exactly how to use the platform I had built. "Joan," she said during one of our planning meetings, "you now have credibility, community support, and documented evidence of their fraudulent behavior. It's time to expose Greg publicly and make it impossible for him to continue his financial schemes." The next community board meeting provided the perfect opportunity. As the coordinator of our expanded mentoring program, I was invited to present a quarterly report on our progress and our plans for the grant money. But I had a more ambitious agenda than simply discussing program statistics. I had spent weeks gathering evidence of Greg's business practices, including documentation of his attempts to defraud investors and testimony from people who had been victimized by his schemes. Laura had helped me prepare a presentation that would systematically expose Greg's pattern of financial fraud while demonstrating my own credibility and competence. When I took the podium at the community board meeting, Greg was sitting in the second row, clearly expecting another opportunity to disrupt my presentation and undermine my authority. He had brought several of his business associates, people he was obviously trying to impress and potentially recruit as investors. I began with my mentoring program report, detailing our accomplishments and outlining our expansion plans. The board members were clearly impressed with our progress and our professional approach to community service. But then I shifted to the real purpose of my presentation. "Unfortunately," I said, my voice taking on a more serious tone, "our program has faced some challenges that I believe the board should be aware of. There have been deliberate attempts to sabotage our work and spread false information about our leadership and our financial integrity." I presented the evidence methodically, showing documentation of Greg's business schemes and playing recordings of conversations where he had admitted to lying about my mental state and financial situation. The board members listened with growing concern as the pattern of harassment and fraud became clear. "These attacks," I continued, "are not random acts of business competition. They are part of a coordinated campaign by certain individuals who are angry that I have refused to be intimidated by their threats and their attempts to exploit my grief and vulnerability." Greg's face was growing redder by the minute. He was clearly struggling to maintain his composure as his own business practices were exposed to potential investors and community leaders. When I finished my presentation, he leaped to his feet with the desperate fury of someone whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "This is exactly what I've been trying to warn people about," he shouted, his voice shrill with panic and rage. "She's completely paranoid and vindictive. She's making up elaborate conspiracy theories because she can't accept that her own family has rejected her for good reason." The board chamber erupted in murmurs of shock and disapproval. Greg's outburst was so inappropriate, so clearly unhinged, that he had destroyed any remaining credibility he might have had. But I wasn't finished with him yet. "I'm glad Greg has chosen to speak," I said calmly, returning to the microphone, "because I have something else to share with the board." I pulled out my phone and connected it to the room's audio system. This is a recording of a phone conversation Greg had with a potential investor just last week, where he admits to forging financial documents and lying about my family situation. Greg's voice filled the chamber, captured in crystal clarity, as he bragged about his schemes to defraud both me and his business partners. The old woman was too trusting to see it coming. his recorded voice said with cruel laughter. "I've got power of attorney documents that will fool any bank, and once we drain her accounts, she'll be too embarrassed to fight back." The reaction was explosive. The board members and audience erupted in expressions of disgust and outrage, and I could see several people recording the moment on their phones, ensuring that Greg's confession would be preserved and shared far beyond this room. The consequences for Greg were swift and devastating. Within hours of the meeting, word of his admission spread throughout the business community. Investors pulled their funding partners, distanced themselves from his ventures, and his carefully built network of professional contacts evaporated overnight. But the most satisfying moment came when Laura approached Greg with a manila envelope as he tried to leave the meeting in disgrace. "Mr. Henderson," she said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "you're being served with a defamation lawsuit. Your lies and harassment have caused substantial damage to my client's reputation and emotional well-being, and we intend to seek full compensation through the courts." Greg's face crumpled as he realized that his war against me had just escalated beyond his ability to control. He had lost his business credibility, his community standing, and now faced serious legal consequences for his actions. As he fled the chamber, I felt the deep satisfaction of justice finally being served. The aftermath of Greg's public humiliation sent shockwaves through Rachel's family that I could feel even from a distance. For weeks, I heard nothing from any of them, and I began to hope that perhaps they had finally learned the consequences of their actions and would leave me in peace. But I should have known that Rachel's pride and desperation would never allow her to accept defeat gracefully. The call came on a Thursday evening while I was reviewing applications for our mentoring program's next group of volunteers. Rachel's voice was tight, with barely controlled fury, but I could also hear something else underneath the anger, genuine fear. Real fear, perhaps, for the first time in her privileged life. "Joan," she began without any pretense of familial courtesy, "what you did to Greg was unconscionable. You've destroyed a man's livelihood and reputation over some petty family disagreement. I'm calling to demand that you drop this ridiculous lawsuit immediately and stop spreading lies about our family." The irony of her words was breathtaking. Rachel, who had spent months trying to destroy my reputation, steal my finances, and have me declared mentally incompetent, was now playing the victim because Greg had faced consequences for his own fraudulent actions. "Rachel," I replied, my voice calm and steady as deep water. "Greg destroyed his own reputation by choosing to wage a public campaign of lies and financial fraud against me. I didn't make him forge documents or admit to criminal behavior on tape. He did all of that himself, and now he's facing the natural consequences of his choices." "But you recorded him." Rachel protested, her voice rising with indignation. "You set him up. You're vindictive and cruel, and you're tearing this family apart over money that doesn't even matter." I felt a sound that might have been laughter bubbling up from deep in my chest. Not a sound of humor, but of amazement at her complete lack of self-awareness. "I'm tearing the family apart, Rachel. You orchestrated a social media campaign to humiliate me publicly. You forged legal documents to steal my savings. You turned my own grandchildren against me with lies. You declared me dead to you and tried to have me institutionalized. And now you want to lecture me about family unity." The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. When Rachel spoke again, her voice had changed. The righteous anger was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like desperation. "Joan, we need to put this behind us. Our family can't survive this kind of public scandal. People are asking questions about Dad's estate, about the way we've been handling his affairs. Sarah is having anxiety attacks because of all the stress. If this continues, everyone will know our business, and the damage will be irreparable. There it was, the real reason for her call. Rachel wasn't concerned about Greg's feelings or family relationships. She was worried about exposure, about the community, discovering the full extent of their fraudulent actions. My public victory at the board meeting had been just the beginning, and she was terrified of what might come next. That's your problem now, Rachel. I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had finally learned their own power. You chose greed over maternal love. You chose cruelty over compassion. You chose lies over truth. Now, you get to face the consequences of those choices, and I'm no longer interested in protecting you from them. But Rachel wasn't ready to accept defeat. Her voice shifted again, taking on the wheedling, manipulative tone I remembered from her childhood when she wanted something she couldn't get through direct demands. Joan, please, think about what Dad would have wanted. He wouldn't have wanted us fighting like this, destroying each other over money and misunderstandings. We're the only family we have left. Can't we find a way to work this out, to forgive and move forward together? The manipulation was so transparent, so calculated, that it was almost insulting. After months of being told I was dead to them, of being called a failed mother and a mentally incompetent burden, Rachel expected me to believe that she suddenly cared about family unity and Robert's wishes. Don't you dare invoke your father's memory to justify your greed, I said, my voice sharp with controlled anger. You know exactly what your father thought about your behavior because he wrote it down in his own handwriting. He was ashamed of what you had become, disappointed in your lack of integrity, and worried about your capacity for manipulation and cruelty. But Joan, Rachel continued, her voice taking on a note of false vulnerability. We're in real financial trouble. Greg's business has collapsed, the legal fees are mounting, and Sarah's anxiety issues are requiring expensive treatment. We need help, and you're the only one who might be able to. I mean, if you have access to resources we don't know about. And there it was, the real purpose of her call. Rachel had finally realized that I wasn't the helpless, penniless victim they had assumed me to be. The success of the mentoring program, the community support, the legal representation, it all suggested that I had access to resources and connections they hadn't known about. She wasn't calling to reconcile. She was calling to probe for information about my financial situation and to position herself for another attempt at exploitation. The calculation behind her fake concern was so obvious, so pathetic, that I felt nothing but cold disgust for the woman who had once been the little girl I had rocked to sleep and comforted through nightmares. Rachel, I said, my voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, let me make something absolutely clear. You are no daughter of mine. A daughter doesn't try to steal her mother's life savings. A daughter doesn't forge legal documents to defraud her own parent. A daughter doesn't turn her children against their grandmother with lies and manipulation. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in completely. You chose to see me as an enemy, as an obstacle to your greed. Fine, that's exactly what I am now. But I'm an enemy you created through your own cruelty, and I'm an enemy you are completely unprepared to face. Joan, please don't do this. Rachel's voice was breaking, now the mask of manipulation finally slipping to reveal genuine panic underneath. We can work something out. We can share Dad's estate, find a compromise. I'll make Sarah apologize, make her take down those posts. We can be family again. No, I said, simply, my voice as final as a door slamming shut. We can't. You killed our family relationship when you chose money over love. You killed it when you threw me out like garbage. You killed it when you tried to steal my identity and my dignity. It's dead, Rachel, and you're the one who killed it. I hung up the phone and immediately called Laura. I need you to file for a restraining order, I told her. I want a legal document that prevents any member of Rachel's family from contacting me, coming to my home, or interfering with my community activities. Consider it done, Laura replied. And Joan, I'm proud of you. You've handled this with more grace and strength than most people could manage. As I sat in my quiet house that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete peace. The emotional chains that had bound me to my abusers were finally broken. I was free to build the life I wanted, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide them. The phone rang several times that night, Rachel's number appearing on the caller ID. But I had blocked it, just as I had blocked all the others. Their voices, their demands, their manipulations could no longer reach me. I had found my strength, my worth, and my boundaries, and I would never again allow anyone to cross them. The war was nearly over, and I had won. 5 months had passed since my final confrontation with Rachel, 5 months of blessed peace and continued success with our youth mentoring program. The restraining order had worked perfectly, creating a legal barrier that finally gave me the space to breathe, to heal, and to build the life I deserved. Our program had expanded beyond anything I had originally imagined, with similar mentoring initiatives now being developed in 3 neighboring communities based on our successful model. I should have known that this period of tranquility was too good to last. Rachel's family had been silent for so long that I had begun to hope they had finally accepted defeat and moved on with their lives. But I had underestimated their capacity for desperate destructive behavior when their backs were against the wall. The community town hall meeting was supposed to be a celebration of our program's first-year accomplishments. I had been invited to present our impact report to the broader community and discuss our plans for creating a regional network of youth support services. The auditorium was packed with supporters, local officials, and representatives from other communities who were interested in replicating our success. I was halfway through my presentation describing how our therapeutic mentoring approach had helped dozens of young people work through family trauma and build resilience when I noticed a commotion near the back of the auditorium. Sarah had entered without invitation, her appearance disheveled, and her eyes red from what appeared to be recent tears. But it was the determined set of her jaw and the phone in her hand that caught my attention and filled me with dread. She didn't wait for an appropriate moment to speak or follow any of the normal protocols for public meetings. Instead, she marched down the center aisle like someone on a desperate mission, her voice rising above my presentation before she even reached the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice shaking with emotion but carrying clearly across the auditorium. "I need to stop this presentation because you're all being deceived by a woman who destroyed her own family with her cruelty and favoritism." The room fell into shocked silence, stunned by the interruption and the serious nature of her accusations. I felt my heart skip a beat, but I forced myself to remain calm, to stay focused on the bigger picture. Sarah was clearly making a last-ditch effort to destroy my credibility, and I needed to be ready for whatever she was planning to unleash. This woman, she continued, pointing directly at me with theatrical desperation, claims to be some kind of expert on family dynamics and youth counseling. But she's the reason I've spent years in therapy trying to recover from childhood emotional abuse. She played favorites, she neglected my emotional needs, and when I finally found the courage to speak up about it, she turned my entire family against me. Sarah pulled out her phone and began live streaming, clearly intending to broadcast her attack to as wide an audience as possible. Her voice grew more confident as she warmed to her theme, using the victim narrative she had been perfecting for months. My mother never loved me the way she loved my sister Rachel. I was always the afterthought, the daughter who had to fight for scraps of attention and affection. When I finally went public with my story, she retaliated by destroying my family, turning my father's memory against me, and using her connections to ruin my sister's husband's business. The impact of her words was immediate and devastating. The audience, many of whom didn't know me personally but were impressed by my professional presentation and program credentials, began to murmur among themselves. Sarah's emotional delivery and obvious distress gave her accusations a weight and authenticity that my calm, grandmother-like appearance couldn't immediately counter. I watched in growing horror as doubt spread through the crowd like wildfire. People who had been nodding approvingly at my presentation just minutes before were now looking at me with suspicion and concern. The town council members were whispering urgently among themselves, clearly wondering if they had been supporting someone who was unfit to work with vulnerable young people. She's using this mentoring program to rehabilitate her image. Sarah continued, her voice growing more passionate as she sensed the crowd's shifting mood. She's taking credit for helping other people's children while refusing to acknowledge the damage she did to her own. How can you trust someone with your kids when she destroyed her own family relationships through favoritism and emotional neglect? The humiliation was intense, more crushing than anything I had experienced during the worst days of my family's betrayal. At least then, the attacks had been private, limited to people who already knew our family dynamics. This was public destruction on a massive scale, broadcast live to anyone who cared to watch, potentially destroying not just my reputation, but the mentoring program that had become my life's work. But as I stood there absorbing the full force of Sarah's attack, feeling the weight of public scorn and suspicion pressing down on me like a physical burden, something unexpected happened. Instead of crumbling under the pressure, I found myself growing calmer, more focused, more determined than ever before. I realized that Sarah had made the same critical tactical error that had destroyed Greg's credibility months earlier. In her desperation to destroy me, she had chosen to make her attack in front of Laura, in front of the teenagers I had mentored successfully for nearly a year, in front of community members who had worked closely with me and knew my character through direct experience. Most importantly, she had given me the perfect platform to present my evidence to the widest possible audience. Laura, sitting in the front row, caught my eye and nodded slightly. She had been preparing for exactly this possibility gathering and organizing documentation that would not only refute Sarah's lies, but expose the full extent of her family's systematic abuse. I stepped back to the microphone, my hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. When I spoke, my voice was calm and clear, carrying the quiet authority of someone who has nothing to hide and nothing to fear from the truth. Thank you, Sarah. I said my words, carrying across the suddenly quiet auditorium. I've been waiting for this opportunity to address your family's campaign of lies and financial abuse in a public forum. And fortunately, I've brought exactly the evidence needed to expose the truth about who the real victim is in this situation. The audience leaned forward, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Sarah's confident expression began to falter as she realized that I wasn't cowering or fleeing as she had expected. Instead, I was preparing to fight back with everything I had, and I had more evidence than she could possibly have imagined. Ladies and gentlemen, I continued, what you've just witnessed is the final act of a coordinated campaign to destroy my reputation and steal my life savings. Sarah's performance tonight is just the latest attempt to manipulate public opinion after months of forged documents, fraudulent legal filings, and systematic elder abuse. Laura rose from her seat and joined me at the front of the auditorium, carrying a briefcase that I knew contained months of careful documentation and evidence gathering. Her presence alone lent immediate credibility to whatever I was about to present, and I could see that Sarah's confidence was beginning to crack as she realized the magnitude of what she was facing. Ladies and gentlemen, I began my voice steady and clear. Sarah has accused me of being a neglectful mother who played favorites and destroyed her family through emotional abuse. I'd like you to see the actual evidence and judge for yourselves who has been telling the truth. Laura opened her briefcase and handed me a carefully organized folder containing documentation that would put Sarah's lies to rest once and for all. But this wasn't just about defending myself anymore. This was about exposing the systematic fraud and abuse that had nearly destroyed my life and would certainly destroy other families if left unchallenged. Sarah claims that I neglected her emotional needs and favored her sister Rachel. I continued opening the folder to reveal pages of evidence. But I have here bank records showing that I spent over $40,000 on Sarah's art education therapy sessions and addiction treatment over the past 10 years. I have documentation showing that Rachel received comparable financial support for her wedding and her children's needs. I began presenting the evidence methodically, each document building a case that demolished Sarah's victim narrative. But more importantly, I have recorded conversations where Sarah admits that she fabricated her story of neglect at Rachel's urging, specifically to manipulate me into giving them access to my life savings and my late husband's estate. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word as I continued to dismantle the lies that had nearly destroyed my reputation. But the most damaging evidence was yet to come. Sarah has portrayed herself as a victim of childhood emotional abuse. I said, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. But I have documentation from her own therapist provided with her written consent years ago when she needed family support, showing that her primary issues stemmed from drug addiction and financial irresponsibility, not from any neglect on my part. Laura stepped forward and addressed the audience directly, her professional training evident in her clear, authoritative presentation. As a licensed family mediator, I've had all of this evidence reviewed by independent experts. What we're looking at is not a case of maternal neglect, but a textbook example of financial elder abuse coordinated by multiple family members to isolate and exploit a vulnerable widow. She held up official documents allowing the town council members and other community leaders to examine them closely. The forged power of attorney documents the manufactured debt, claims the fraudulent eviction notices. All of this represents a systematic attempt to steal Joan's life savings and force her into an assisted living facility where she could be more easily controlled. But the most powerful moment came when I turned to face Sarah, directly looking her in the eye, as I delivered the truth that would destroy her credibility completely. Sarah, I said, my voice carrying across the auditorium, you've built your entire victim story on the claim that I favored Rachel over you, but I have something else to share with this community. I activated my phone's speaker system, and Sarah's own voice filled the chamber, captured in crystal clear audio as she discussed her true motivations. "Mom's so gullible," her recorded voice said with cruel laughter. "She actually believes all that stuff about unconditional love and family loyalty. Rachel and I have been planning this for months. Once we get her declared incompetent, we can split everything 50-50 and never have to deal with her guilt trips again. The reaction was explosive. The audience erupted in expressions of disgust and outrage, and I could see several people recording the moment on their phones, ensuring that Sarah's confession would be preserved and shared far beyond this room. Sarah's face went from confident to ashen gray as she realized that her own words had just destroyed her completely. The emotional victim narrative she had been building for months crumbled in seconds, replaced by the ugly truth of calculated greed and manipulation. "That recording is illegal," she shouted, her voice cracking with panic and desperation. "You can't use that against me. That's entrapment." "Actually," Laura replied calmly, "the recording was made during a 3-way call with a family counselor who was trying to facilitate reconciliation. Sarah was informed that the session was being recorded for therapeutic purposes, and she gave her explicit consent. The recording is completely legal and completely admissible in the criminal charges we'll be filing." The crowd's condemnation was swift and merciless. People who had initially been swayed by Sarah's emotional performance now saw her for what she truly was, a manipulative adult child who had tried to destroy her own mother for financial gain. Several community members approached me to apologize for their initial doubts and to offer their continued support. But the most satisfying moment came when I saw 2 uniformed police officers enter the auditorium. Laura had coordinated with law enforcement to be present for Sarah's inevitable public confession, and they were ready to take action based on the evidence that had just been presented. Sarah Ellis, one of the officers, said, approaching her with professional calm, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder abuse and financial fraud. You have the right to remain silent." The transformation in the room was complete. What had begun as Sarah's attempt to destroy my reputation had become her own public confession and arrest. As she was led away in handcuffs, still protesting her innocence, the audience turned to me with expressions of admiration and support that warmed my heart. Within days, the consequences of Sarah's exposure rippled through every aspect of her life and Rachel's. The criminal charges led to a full investigation of their fraudulent activities, resulting in the discovery of forged documents, unauthorized financial transactions, and a systematic pattern of elder abuse that had been carefully planned and executed. Rachel, faced with overwhelming evidence of her complicity in the fraud, found herself under criminal investigation as well. Her social standing evaporated overnight as friends and neighbors learned the truth about what she had done to her own mother. The comfortable life she had built through manipulation and exploitation crumbled as legal bills mounted, and her reputation was destroyed beyond repair. 8 months passed after Sarah's arrest and the collapse of Rachel's world. 8 months of profound peace and continued growth in my new life. The criminal trials had resulted in convictions for both daughters, with Sarah receiving probation and community service, while Rachel faced more serious consequences for her role as the primary organizer of the fraud. The mentoring program had grown stronger than ever, with donations pouring in from people who wanted to support someone who had survived such systematic family abuse. But I should have known that Rachel's pride and desperation would never allow her to accept defeat gracefully, even in the face of criminal conviction and social exile. The final attempt at manipulation came on a cold December morning, just days before Christmas, when the symbolism of family and forgiveness might make me most vulnerable to her pleas. I was in my kitchen, preparing cookies for the teenagers in our mentoring program when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Looking out the window, I saw a figure I barely recognized walking slowly toward my front door. Rachel looked terrible, her once perfect appearance replaced by something that spoke of months of stress, legal battles, and social isolation. Her expensive clothes were gone, replaced by something that looked like it had come from a thrift store. She knocked on my door hesitantly, not with the commanding presence she had once brought to our confrontations, but with the uncertainty of someone who was no longer sure of their welcome anywhere. When I opened the door, she immediately launched into what was clearly a rehearsed performance of contrition and desperation. Joan. She sobbed, her tears appearing genuine, but her timing suspiciously calculated. Please forgive me. Please give me one more chance to make this right. I know I've done terrible, unforgivable things, but I'm begging you to find it in your heart to show mercy to your daughter. She fell to her knees on my front porch, clutching at my doorframe like a drowning woman grasping for rescue. But I had learned to see through her performances, to recognize the calculation behind even her most emotional displays. I was wrong about everything, Joan. I let greed and fear cloud my judgment. I let Greg and Sarah convince me that you were trying to keep us from our inheritance, that you were playing favorites and manipulating Dad. I should have trusted my own heart, should have remembered how much you sacrificed for our family over the years. She continued her tearful confession, weaving a narrative that painted her as another victim of manipulation rather than the architect of my torment. According to her revised version of events, she had been misled by Greg's business advice and Sarah's emotional manipulation, acting out of misguided loyalty rather than calculated greed. But even as she performed her act of contrition, I could see her eyes calculating, searching for signs of weakness or sympathy that she could exploit. And sure enough, as her sobs began to subside, her true purpose began to emerge with painful transparency. Joan, I need your help. Not just your forgiveness, but your actual help. The legal fees, the criminal charges, the loss of our social standing. It's destroyed us financially and emotionally. The house is in foreclosure. Greg can't find work anywhere, and Sarah's addiction issues have gotten worse since the arrest. She looked up at me with what she clearly hoped was an expression of vulnerable sincerity. I know I don't deserve your kindness after everything I've done, but you're the only family I have left. If you could find it in your heart to help us get back on our feet, I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making up for the pain I caused you. The manipulation was so obvious, so pathetically transparent, that I felt nothing but cold disgust for the woman kneeling on my porch. Even in her moment of supposed contrition, she was still trying to exploit me, still calculating how to extract money and resources from my success. I looked down at her with complete emotional detachment, feeling neither anger nor pity, nor any remnant of the maternal love that had once defined our relationship. That love had died under the weight of her systematic cruelty, and nothing she could say or do would ever resurrect it. Rachel, I said quietly, my voice carrying the calm finality of someone who has moved completely beyond the reach of manipulation. You seem to be confused about something fundamental. I'm not your mother anymore. You stopped being my daughter the moment you chose to see me as your enemy, rather than the woman who gave you life and love. I stepped back from the doorway, creating physical distance that matched the emotional chasm between us. You didn't just hurt me, Rachel. You tried to destroy me systematically and completely. You forged legal documents. You turned my granddaughter against me. You had me publicly humiliated and nearly institutionalized. You declared me dead to you and tried to steal everything I had worked for my entire life. Her face began to crumble as she realized that her performance wasn't working, that the old Joan who could be guilted and manipulated was gone forever, replaced by someone who valued herself too much to accept abuse from anyone. You made your choice when you decided that money was more important than the mother who raised you. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. You chose greed over gratitude, cruelty over compassion, lies over love. Now you have to live with the consequences of those choices, and I am no longer willing to rescue you from them. I stepped back and began to close the door, but Rachel made one last desperate attempt to force her way back into my life. Joan, please, I'm your daughter. We share the same blood. Doesn't that mean anything to you anymore? Don't you remember the little girl who used to crawl into bed with you during thunderstorms? No, I said, simply, my voice as final as a grave closing. That little girl died when she chose to become a woman who would steal from her own mother. What you destroyed can never be rebuilt, Rachel. What you killed can never be brought back to life. I closed the door firmly and locked it symbolically, and literally shutting her out of my life forever. Through the window, I watched her sit on my porch for several more minutes, perhaps hoping I would relent, perhaps simply processing the reality that her last desperate gambit had failed completely. When she finally stood up and walked back to her car, I felt Laura's hand on my shoulder. She had arrived as planned, carrying the legal documents that would make Rachel's banishment official and permanent. The updated restraining order is ready to be served, Laura said gently. She won't be able to approach you again without facing immediate arrest. As Rachel drove away, disappearing from my life, for what I knew would be the final time, I felt a profound sense of completion wash over me. The war that had started with her greed and betrayal was finally truly over. I had won not just the legal battles and the public vindication, but the deeper war for my own soul, my own worth, my own right to live in peace and dignity. Today, as I sit in my beautifully restored home, surrounded by the warmth and laughter of my chosen family from the mentoring program, I can barely recognize the broken woman I was just 3 years ago. My house, once threatened with fraudulent foreclosure through Rachel's schemes, now serves as an informal community center where young people and their families gather to share meals, celebrate achievements, and support each other through life's inevitable challenges. The youth mentoring program has expanded beyond anything I originally imagined, with our model now being replicated in 12 communities across 3 states. I spend my days working with teenagers who remind me daily that resilience can bloom even in the most difficult circumstances, that love and support can heal even the deepest wounds, and that families can be built through choice and commitment rather than just blood and DNA. Most remarkably, I have learned to value my own worth independent of anyone else's approval or rejection. The painful lessons taught by Rachel and Sarah's betrayal have transformed into wisdom that I share with other seniors who face similar family exploitation. I understand now that love freely given is beautiful, but love demanded through manipulation is worthless. I have boundaries that cannot be crossed, standards that will not be lowered, and a sense of self that no longer depends on other people's validation or acceptance. My relationship with my grandchildren remains severed, a loss that still brings me sadness during quiet moments. But I have found peace in knowing that I cannot control the lies they were told about me, only the truth I live every day. Perhaps someday they will seek me out, and if they do, they will find a grandmother who has learned to protect her heart while never losing her capacity for genuine love. The lessons I've learned through this painful journey have shaped not just my own recovery, but my work with others who face similar betrayals. Family relationships built on exploitation and manipulation are not sacred bonds to be preserved at any cost. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to step away from people who see you as nothing more than a resource to be consumed. True peace comes not from others' approval, but from embracing your own inherent worth and refusing to accept less than you deserve. Betrayal wounds deeply, but it also reveals strengths you never knew you possessed. When people show you who they truly are through their actions, believe them the first time and respond accordingly. As I sit here this evening, working on a new quilt that will soon warm someone in need, I find myself reflecting on the unexpected gifts that have emerged from my darkest hours. The threads of different colors and textures that I'm weaving together remind me that even the most painful experiences can become part of something beautiful and useful when approached with wisdom and care. My stitches hold firm and true, each one a small act of hope and healing. And just like my quilting, my faith in the possibility of genuine love and family continues stronger now because it's built on truth rather than wishful thinking.